um, uh, according to national definitions, this is not something that is laid down, although we subject ourselves to international audit. So reduce inequality, for example, how is that defined? By 2030, again, Agenda 2030, achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. So these are goals reflected in targets. And when I come to the India discussion, I'll talk about how we go from targets to indicators for India, which Niti Aayog is responsible for, and at the level of individual states. And I'll tell you a little bit about how Jharkhand is doing that. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, so we're going from background now to localization. And I'm talking here now of exclusively an India model. But I do have to say that there's been a lot of innovation done by my predecessors before I came to Niti Aayog, which has attracted a lot of global attention, and it was my privilege to make a presentation in July at the UN on the Indian model of localization. And let me also say that those of you who are interested, there is a report available for downloading on the Niti Aayog website called the India Model of SDG Localization. So what is localization? Well, localization is the process of recognizing sub-national contexts in the achievement of the 2030 agenda, steered by Niti Aayog as the nodal agency for monitoring the 2030 agenda. And we'll go into this in more detail in subsequent slides, but basically this is a three-step process: setting of goals and targets to determine the means of implementation, identification of indicators to measure and monitor progress, in addition to raising awareness, and advocacy with shareholders, including central ministries, sub-national governments, and civil society. You are, many of you, management students, and I don't know who first said what gets measured gets done, but that's a favorite maxim in business schools. And let me tell you that from this point of view, Prime Minister Modi, could teach us all a thing or two about management, because if it can't be measured, he's not interested. And a lot of what Niti Aayog does is to get data, assemble indicators, and I think there's a lesson for all of you as you go out into the wide world of management. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Indian model of SDG localization stands on four pillars. It is, in that sense, a chair rather than a stool. First, create institutional ownership. Second, establish a robust review and monitoring system. Third, develop capacities for integrating SDGs in planning and monitoring. And I'm here talking, yes, at the union level, but particularly at the state level. And fourth, Sabka Saath, promoting a whole of society approach. Within these four pillars, there are various political institutions, if you will, or governance institutions involved, union ministries, whose goal it is to align national policies with the SDGs, set targets, and monitor implementation. And we help them in this through, amongst other things, our review of expenditure and our monitoring and evaluation. Parliament and state legislative assemblies, they provide legislative oversight at both the state and union level. And then much of what I'm going to talk about is at the level of states and UTs, but I'd better rush because I'm at the 20-minute mark. Next, please. So here is an example of institutional structure at the level of states, the legislature, a high-level committee chaired by the secretary, then a planning department, which is the nodal department for SDG coordination and monitoring, line departments under the chief secretary, responsible for program implementation. Economics and statistics are particularly important, and then at the district level, not at the state level, a district SDG cell. So it's quite complicated. Let me just say that in Jharkhand, the progress on SDGs is reviewed at the level of the chief secretary or sometimes the chief minister. The state has shortlisted 253 indicators within its state indicator framework, and Jharkhand is on track to compile a district indicator framework. I think we can rush through the next slide. Okay, yeah. So this is, I won't go through all the numbers, but I think it's important for you to know that 30 of India's 36 jurisdictions have, in 4 short years, I would remind you, created an SDG center or cell at the state level. 29 of them have come up with the state indicator framework, and 30 of them have come up with a mapping of SDG targets with schemes and departments. So all of this is part of the second pillar of establishing a robust review and monitoring system at the subnational level as a part of cooperative and competitive federalism. Now we're on to pillar 3, which is developing capacity and finally promoting a whole of society approach. I think this speaks for itself, but let me just say, in the case of Jharkhand, we have taken several initiatives, or Jharkhand has undertaken with our support and the support of the UN, several initiatives for sectoral capacity building. And just a word on the whole of society approach. Each national government has the opportunity at the UN to undertake peer review by other nations and essentially hold itself accountable to something called a voluntary national review. And as part of that voluntary national review in 2020, Niti Aayog undertook widespread consultations with civil society organizations. Now, why is this important? It's important because of a philosophy of nobody left behind, and therefore to have workshops with civil society, with disadvantaged groups like SCSTs in the state, tribals. It's very important in a sense to get a feel for whether these initiatives are actually reaching the intended beneficiaries. Okay, we now go on to, I should also mention in the case of Jharkhand that the partnership has been with UNICEF. Now, finally, in the interest of time, SDG monitoring. This is done in India by Niti Aayog, next slide please, at the national level by producing something called the SDG India Index, which is a work in progress. It gets steadily more refined as more indicators become available. All of this is available online on a dashboard. So the baseline report tracked 13 goals, 39 targets. You can read this for yourself. The 2021 report, which of course took place at the time of COVID, actually it was retrospective, so it doesn't. So it's really the version that is underway right now, which is which will give us a sense of what the backsliding has been because of COVID. So just to say that we work hard on the data to pull together an SDG index, and that SDG index also has state rankings. Next slide, please. Um, this will just tell you, in the interest of credibility, how we collect the data and the come up with the indicators, and it's quite a substantial exercise. Secondary government sources, national surveys, and ministry data. A lot of it is secondary government data. National survey reports include the National Sample Survey, NFHS. State departments are urged to update, reconcile data in the union ministries' dashboards, portals. That's not always easy, and where possible, we use a framework called output to outcome to measure progress under schemes. Next slide, please. So this is how the SDG index is pulled together. We have equal weights on, so I beg your pardon, that's the next slide. So there's a process of identification, normalization, weighting, individual goal scores, and then finally a composite score. And in some of the final slides, you will get to see, as it were, classifications: achiever, front runner, performer, aspirant. Next slide. This will give you a sense of the final scores and where India has done relatively well. We are front runners in good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, reduced inequalities. Not to say that this is perfect, this is just with respect to the baseline. And the panel on the right gives you some sense of how Jharkhand has progressed over the same 3 years. Next slide, please. Just a word before I conclude on the multi-dimensional poverty index. There are two ways in which poverty is measured globally. One is on the basis of a kind of poverty line, a headcount index. That had been more common, but ever since the Human Development Report started to bless a multidimensional poverty index, because it's better aligned with the SDGs, India contributes to the global tally of the multi-poverty index, which is assembled by the UNDP, and the main data source for that is the National Family Health Survey. And this will give you both the components and the weights of the three components of the multidimensional poverty index: health, education, standard of living. In the case of India, we have added two additional indicators: maternal health and bank accounts. Okay, I think I'm at the half-an-hour mark, and I've more or less said all I want to at the global level. Let me just spend another 2 or 3 minutes on what individual states are doing, and then allow time for questions and answers. I'd mentioned that states have seized this initiative and run with it. And so in the next slide, you'll get a sense of what individual states have been doing. Next slide, please. So there's reports by Uttarakhand. I believe that's I can't see. So again, this is to show you that the Sustainable Development Goals have started to impact, particularly in those states where planning ministries and finance ministries are together. They've started to influence two things: budget allocation and also the adoption of the so-called output outcome monitoring framework. Next slide. I think we can skip this as just more examples of the same. This is now pushing it down from the state level to the district level. I think I'll close there. What I wanted to persuade you about was perhaps three things. One is that it's quite important and remarkable that a global community of 180 nations have come up with a common view of the good life and have come up with a view on how sustainability and, if you like, social progress can and should be combined. This is important, it is precious. Second, that India is very important to the SDGs and the SDGs are important to India. Third, that as citizens, you have the right to hold your state governments accountable on the basis of published dashboards for what they are achieving and perhaps not achieving with regard to the SDGs. And finally, I had briefly mentioned this program or initiative of Prime Minister Modi called Lifestyle for the Environment. His idea is that the traditions of India of frugality, of sustainability, of recycling should be the basis of a global Jan Andolan where each citizen believes it's his responsibility in his, well, I should say in her own behavior, not his, and in nudging the behavior of others to, as it were, care for the planet, what he calls pro-planet people. I suspect that this generation is instinctively more pro-planet people. I've got to learn this. You have been raised in it. All of you, the younger ones, have a massive contribution to make as leaders. I thank XLRI for this opportunity. Would you wish me to take questions from here or over there? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your thought-provoking and inspiring oration. Shiberi will now take questions from the audience from his seat. We will take the first question from the audience here at Jamshedpur. If you have any question, I request you to come to the mic placed in front of you.
Hello. Am I audible? Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for the enlightening session. I have two questions. My first question is, with the global context, we have seen that there is a divide between developed nations and developing nations, and there is a general disagreement with the quotas that are assigned. So coming to the context of India, since the theme of the session is SDG localization, do we suspect or do we anticipate a potential problem that states might have in their relationship? Like coming from Jharkhand, I've seen that the coal which is mined in Jharkhand, most of it goes to power high consumption intensive lifestyle places like Delhi and metro cities. And then again, there's the rural urban divide. So is there, from the policy making point of view, is there, how would we go about resolving potential disputes and tension between high consumption and low consumption states, given that India itself is a lot like the world. We are a subcontinent, we are a very diverse microcosm. So with all these diversities that we have between states, there will, I anticipate that there will be states that will have a grievance that we are not consuming as much. So what are policy measures from your insight that will help resolve such disputes and bring us all on an amicable note so we can come up on an integral developmental policy? My second question is, yeah.
Okay. I'm afraid back here the acoustics aren't great. So I'll just rephrase the question as I understood it, which is that there are low consumption and high consumption pockets. Sometimes the environmental consequences of high consumption are faced by low consumption states. Is this a source of tension, and what are the instruments for handling it? Is that roughly what you asked?
Yes, sir, precisely. Thank you.
Okay. Look, I'm discovering for the first time in government how subtle, sophisticated, and mature the Indian political system is. And, let me, note that for all our, and I'm not only talking of what's been happening in the UK in the last month, but, given our scale, size, linguistic diversity, I don't think we acknowledge the achievement of what? Since now 1998, 25 years of full 5-year government. So that tells you something about the innate stability of the country, even when we have a very raucous political debate. That's point number one. Okay? That is a reality of how negotiation works in India. Second, it is to take account of issues like this that we have institutions like the finance commissions. And also why we have institutions like, if you like, royalty payment, etc., the whatever it's called, the mining district development fund, etc. So these are instruments that are meant to acknowledge this. And then it's a question of whether local legislators are able to use those funds properly. And if I'm not being too vain or parochial, I would say Niti Aayog is one such instrument or tool. We convene something called the Governing Council, where all chief ministers attend. And it was a awe-inspiring moment for me to host or to convene the Governing Council at Rashtrapati Bhavan in August, because there you saw, as perhaps you do in the GST Council, chief ministers not as politicians, but as development practitioners. And so they are searching for solutions. Always there will be some people who want to make a political point because it suits them in their at that political moment, but they are rare. So the quality of discourse when chief ministers assume the role of development agents rather than politicians, and they have to be both, is impressive, and I would be, as it were, I would take comfort in that. I don't know if that satisfies you, but that's what I've seen up till now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
We will be taking the second question from Accelerate Delhi NCR audience through Zoom.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
So, Mr. Berry, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Since you did talk about the SDG progress state-wise, I did see that Kerala seemed to be the best performer, and Bihar apparently the worst performer. And if you can also include the performance of UP and Gujarat, and explain to us why these differences and how can the laggers, come up in the achievement of these goals. Is there been a study? Is there a big systemic difference in the way these things are managed in these states?
I'm too new in the job to have a very granular answer to that, so I'll give a schematic answer rather than a case-by-case answer. In any case, comparisons are somewhat invidious. So I think we are focused here, or we should be focused here, largely on progress over time, because that's what the government of the day can affect, rather than, as it were, legacy issues. Now, we all know that on the sorts of indicators that the SDGs capture, health and education in particular, for historical reasons, Kerala has had a head start, even from pre-colonial times, and there's been a lot of writing on that. So our main purpose is to maintain credibility in the scores and hold up the mirror and expect competitive federalism to, as it were, generate the impetus. After all, these are elected state governments, okay? They have limited resources, they have to choose their priorities. We are just saying that, either as determined by the global community or as tweaked by Niti Aayog for the Indian circumstances, this is the set of development values, interlocking development values, on which we have collectively agreed that we want to be judged. And you, as elected sovereign government with access to centrally sponsored schemes, with access to resources under devolution, under the Finance Commission, it is your role and job to establish your priorities in the expectation that then that over time will lead to an increase in your score. Having said that, I would make the point that to my taste, and I had nothing to do with it, the SDGs are a little light on economic growth. They've got decent jobs as one of the SDGs, and are much heavier or longer on social criteria. And this is coming from a worldview, a philosophy where, it is, and this is before COVID, where the focus is very much on leaving no one behind. But the fact is, all of this needs fiscal resources. And so I would say that many of the states are now very focused on reviving growth. And I would say, even if they don't get a score on the SDGs right away, they probably will reap benefits over the long run. So, as you may know, UP has a very elaborate program for becoming a $5 trillion economy in the course of this decade. I don't know if there's something similar in Jharkhand. So I would say that this is early days. It's within an agreed framework. We are working on the numbers, and it really depends on chief ministers and chief secretaries to then decide which of the SDGs they wish to give priority to.
We'll be taking the next question from Accelerate Delhi NCR. If anyone from the Delhi NCR campus has any questions, they can ask.
Everybody is restless for high tea.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Hi, so I had a question. You mentioned that India is going to be the president of the G20 summit starting December. You also mentioned that many countries are not on track to achieving their SDG goals. So how can this be tackled exactly? Because there's, as you also said, they're not legally binding. So how can this issue be tackled?
Let me answer that question by returning to the so-called Paris Agreement, technically the Conference of Parties, COP, what was it at that time, COP 15 was it? No, COP 21. That marked an important, some would say unfortunate, change in how the global world, how the community of nations saw collective progress. Prior to that, particularly at the Copenhagen COP, the idea was very much that countries needed to sign up to this commitment, that commitment. The big conceptual shift at Paris was the concept of the nationally determined contributions. Countries would, as it were, seek a domestic political consensus and make a commitment within a framework established by something called the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which of course the Sustainability Center here is familiar with, that look, this is what we commit to our own populations. We will do because we believe climate change is a threat to the world. And there is this concept in the UNFCCC of common but differentiated responsibilities. I would suggest that we think of the G20 much in the way that I've presented the role of Niti Aayog in cooperative and competitive federalism, which is to say that Agenda 2030 is an agreed set of standards that the globe's leaders solemnly have said we subscribe to. Okay, and if this is to be anything other than words, then your actions have to be consistent with that pledge, and it's no more than a pledge. And so the role of each G20 chair, and dare I say, also of the UN Secretary General, is to say to all the G20 countries, but he has been particularly harsh on the rich countries, guys and ladies, you made a commitment in 2015. When we examine your behavior in the pandemic on things like vaccines, on, as it were, the abundance of financial resources that were available for your national populations and the niggardly response in terms of foreign aid, etc., you, by letting the SDGs stagnate, you have not, as it were, lived up to your commitment. India as the G20 chair, and given, as it were, its embrace of the G20, is certainly in a position to hold that mirror up. and there is quite an elaborate machinery for G20 SDG coordination. It's existed for some time. And then it becomes, as I said before, a political issue, which is, given the situation of Europe with the conflict, given the situation in the United States with a very difficult midterm election coming up, given the situation in Britain, which I don't need to stress, what is it that countries feel able to commit to? But just as important, what is the, what are the excuses that they're going to come up with? If I could come to another domestic example, many of you know that the Reserve Bank of India took upon itself a very demanding set of targets for its inflation targeting. Now, it so happens that given what's happening in energy prices, given what's happening on vegetable prices, given that we're coming off a pandemic, they were not actually able to deliver on that commitment. And so what is expected of them? Well, they have to write a letter to the finance minister explaining their point of view. So I would say in a world of sovereign states, a deeply polarized world of sovereign states, that's about as much as you can expect. I would argue it's better than nothing, because without this, we are in a world of anarchy. With this, at least there are some agreed standards.
May I request for the next question from the Jamshedpur audience?
A very good evening, sir. Thank you for the insightful speech. My question is, since localization of SDG requires nationwide participation, so how do we plan to include the marginalized communities and the remote rural areas? And also, what are the challenges that we are expecting in this, and how has the COVID affected this?
Well, I mean, those are three very large questions. Again, I insist that the responsibility within the existing framework of centrally sponsored schemes and MREGA, Mahatma Gandhi Nrega, MG Nrega, I'm never quite not sure how to pronounce it. So these are political decisions of states. What NITI can do is measure and to broker consultations, and as I said, we did that in 2020 around the voluntary national review presented at the United Nations. An important agenda item for the Honorable Prime Minister, who after all has been Chief Minister of a state for 2 terms, is that he believes that a lot more should and can happen at the district level. And we, under his guidance, we meaning Niti Aayog, have had a so-called aspirational districts program, ADP, and indeed this morning I visited. It was a much less intensive visit than I would have liked, but it so turns out that Ranchi itself is an aspirational district, and so I was taken to Kanke and to some sites there, so a health center. And it is, and after all, districts, 700 districts, 150 crore people. I mean, districts are of the order of 2 or 3 million, 30 lakhs. And at that level, you can, as it were, have micro interventions. It's not easy, but actually, again, on the social indicator side, our aspirational districts program, which is very intensively monitored and where data has to be generated to monitor it, shows surprisingly quick progress just because of monitoring. I think a view of Prime Minister, and I would defer to him on this, is that focus and attention and monitoring and management is what you're here to learn, are actually as, if not more important than money. That the shortage is not always of money, the shortage is of focused attention. So that would be my response. It's a state responsibility, but states themselves are larger than many European countries. I can only tell you that I had 4 years living in Holland as the chief economist of Shell, and the amount of delegation and decentralization to urban local bodies, as we would call them, in a sense, that's the reason a Belgium or a Holland can exist without a national government for months, because all the important services are delivered by local governments. So I would say that that sort of political and financial delegation, some of which has been facilitated by the 15th Finance Commission, those are the directions in which we probably need to move. NITI's role is to support this and track it and monitor it.
Thank you, sir.
We will be having one last question from the Delhi NCR audience.
Sir, talking about the net.
Good evening. Sorry for the confusion. So, sir, I just had a simple question. So, you mentioned about your experience as working in Shell in Holland. So that you have worked especially in the industry itself and also in a different country. So, I wanted to know, as you said that for a goal as ambitious as SGD plan, we require new and fresh perspectives. So do you think your experience in the industry was more valuable in this, or do you think there is a need of fresher perspectives, or there is a need of newer ideas to solve these pressing challenges? So which is more valuable, say the industry experience or the outside opinions? Thank you.
Look, this will sound a little, how should I put it? What I would say is I've learned more in 4 months of 5 months of being around the Prime Minister in terms of seeing things through a fresh lens, and I'm being perfectly honest, than at the World Bank or at Shell or whatever. He is really a lateral thinker, and he will, and very practical, and he will come up with angles and suggestions. So, for example, we had a workshop of chief secretaries in Dharamsala, and he had the topic was the new education policy, And, his practical suggestion was just make sure that there's a photograph of the teacher in every classroom so that if somebody else is taking the class, the children can go back and snitch to their mother that, this is not the person whose portrait. Now, that is insightful, brilliant, obvious after the effect, but why did nobody think of it, So to me, it's that kind of jugaad thinking that actually is what works in India. And I would hope that many of you, all of you, will retain that freshness rather than thinking that because, it's come in a textbook or you've been taught it in your teacher. So, and I do think in that sense, there's something about, as it were, our collective upbringing in India. I can tell you, having lived in the US for almost 30 years and having, friends there, etc., there is something very valuable about the degree of, as it were, and the complexity of of social engagement in India. It really is an asset. People here learn from each other, whereas, I would say people in the United States learn from television. Okay, so people sit in front of the idiot box, and that is all they see and know. I mean, we are still fortunate, I think, to be an interactive culture. And so I would say to all of you, don't lose that. That's being embedded in a matrix of social relations and community relations. You can't imagine what a source of social capital that is, and it is one of the things that makes me very optimistic about India. I wasn't wanting to evade your question, but you stimulated me in a different direction, which is that India, for goodness sake, is 1/6 of the world. All of you have to come up with the right solutions for India, and indeed, I saw this today at Tisco, the solutions that, the Tatars came up for India. So that is our inheritance, and I look to all of you, as a generation that may actually stay back more than mine did, to pull your weight in the India that is in this Ambedkar Ka Mahotsav.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shri Berry, for answering the questions and providing insightful clarifications. May I now call upon Dr. Sanjay Patro to give the vote of thanks.
Good evening. First, may I call upon our director, Father S. George, to present the mementos to our distinguished Oration speaker, Sri Suman Berry. Our distinguished ninth Dr. Verghese Kurien, Oration speaker, Dr. Suman Berry, Father George, our director, Mr. Raghu, my esteemed colleagues, students, members of the press. We are indeed privileged to have Dr. Berry spend, half a day with us. We thought he will check in just 10 minutes before 4 o'clock and come straight to the auditorium. He ensured that he spends more time amongst the faculty and the students. There was a change in the plan, and he came early, was in IC for some time, interacted with faculty and with the SAC members. And then before coming there, he came here and took a look at the podium, came to the stage and saw all the arrangements. Coming from where he is, having spent close to 30 years at World Bank, and after spending 20 years in the World Bank, he was called upon immediately after liberalization. 91, all you know, Manmohan Singh and the then late Prime Minister Narasimha Rao unleashed an era of liberalization, and Dr. Berry came to India and he was advising the RBI on monetary policy, debt policy. That speaks of, his understanding of India and the global economy, which was relied upon by the great economist Manmohan Singh. Coming to today's occasion, Verghese Kurien Oration, I had the privilege of being a student of the institute where he was the chairman. As a student, I had personal interaction with Dr. Kurien. Every time he would come spend time with faculty and have a cup of tea with different batches of the students. And there are several anecdotes, I would not get into it, but he is a great man who could see, think of, he was with Tata Steel, as many of you would know, he was with Tata Steel, went to US for a metallurgy MS, comes back as a part of his scholarship. He had to work in some rural sector, cooperative sector. It so happened that he went to Anand and he was supposed to be there for about 4 years, and he spent his entire life there, and he finally, his wish was to be buried, to be cremated at Anand itself, though he hailed from Kerala. The revolutionary waves that he brought in the dairy sector, when our per capita consumption was just 110 grams per day in 1950, today it is 423. Today, dairy sector is contributing 5% to our economy and engaging 80 million dairy farmers. Had the same kind of growth been possible, revolutionary change been possible in 3-4 other commodities, would have been a developed country by now. And his birthday, which is next month, November 26th, is celebrated as the Milk Day in India. And he is popularly known as the milkman of India. After Mr. Berry came into, in recent years, after having a stint at Royal Shell, last 6 months he is the chairman of Niti Aayog, and his plans, his suggestions for to the ministry, to the government, to the policy makers is of great help to tide the difficulties that India is going through currently. Mr. Berry mentioned the turmoil, the turbulent, the turbulent times world is going through, and especially after the Ukraine war, the energy situation has become very volatile. But in such a world of tremors, we have a safe haven, that is India, and we attribute a part of that to our distinguished Oration speaker, Mr. Berry. We are very happy to have you here, Mr. Berry, on this important occasion. I thank our Dean Administration, Father Donald, for an excellent arrangement and for taking care of each nitty and gritty to see that the function goes off well. Our from his office, James and Rumpi, from Director's office, Anuja and Sumi from my office, Sanjay, Sangeeta, Prasad, and all the staff. There are Davasis and Aveen from the IT, and there are many others who have worked tirelessly to see that everything goes off very well. I thank Mr. Chanak Chaudhary, VP Corporate Services, for being here, and the other distinguished guests. Few of our distinguished alum are here, and the members of the press. I thank you all for paying our tribute to Dr. Kurien and in listening very carefully to Dr. Berry. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. I request everyone to please rise for the national anthem.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Faculty interaction with the chief guest is at MDP lawns as soon as we disperse. May I request you all to join us for some snacks in front of the Tata Auditorium. Thank you.